to this edition of the Fireside Chats. As always, with me is Mr. Andrew Valkuskus, who I will pronounce his name wrong on purpose this time because I did it right a few weeks ago. So, basically, as always, well, not as always, but on the occasion, we have with us today as well is Michelle Franklin, basically the writer of our words are hard, but pretty much creatures of fairy tale and myth. She's been working on the Celtic Encyclopedia, and also, the mystical adventures of Mindel and his, misadventures, sorry, my bad.
Misadventures of Mindel Plotostir.
Thank you.
Which is not a real name.
Words, apparently. So, yeah, and of course with us is a very special guest today, is a Dr. Jackson Crawford. So, as always, we like to start off by the guest kind of just giving us a quick rundown of who you are, what you do, and, well, yeah, so welcome aboard, and just give us your spiel.
Well, thanks so much for the kind welcome. I am just some dude in a square-shaped state, but I guess if you get down to the nitty-gritty, I teach stuff like Norse language, myth, sagas, runes, that sort of thing, formerly at various universities, UCLA, Berkeley, and Colorado, and now full-time public educator on YouTube, and also by means of my books and a lot of consulting gigs and et cetera, blah, blah, blah.
All right.
Tell them about your new book.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I just got my...
your galley
just
copy.
Got the first printed copy. Yeah, it's got advanced proof at the top, so most of them won't have the white stripe. But yeah, this is the very first one. So, and my fourth book.
Yeah, nice.
So it's a lot of work.
This guy's going to need a companion on the bookshelf.
Oh, there's number one, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like my publisher's gone with this kind of Aurora theme for 1, 2, and 4. 3 is different. Actually, 3 is still kind of my favorite cover. But I love this theme, and the reason for the bear is because there's a lot of bear men in one of these sagas, the Saga for Kraki.
Berserkers.
So, yeah. Well, and literal bear men, like men who turn into bears.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
So it's full of just bear guys of all description, and moose guys.
Well, it also fits your theme. It fits your aesthetic, your Rocky Mountain aesthetic.
Does it? I suppose so. I mean, I've had my encounters with bears, some of them very close. We coexist.
Because they know who you are and they want an autograph. Don't be rude to them. They're trying for you.
Yeah, the one that broke into the house wanted a little more than that. But,
he was hungry.
You had a bear inside the house?
Oh, yeah.
What cut? Was it a grizzly or is it a black bear?
No, black bear. If it had been a grizzly bear, it would have been a pretty different story. No, just a black bear just leaned in through a screen door. No, I've had encounters with grizzlies too, of course, but never in the house.
If they're already in your house, it's already over.
Well, the black bear was okay. I mean, he just did his business and left. But it certainly startled some of us.
Oh my goodness.
We had black bears around, not necessarily where I lived. I grew up in the ghetto, but we had black bears around where my aunt lived. And they used to tell people, oh, if you see small black bear, just go, "Rah," and they'll run away but sometimes they'll do a bluff charge, which is very frightening, but they'll do it and then they run away.
I've seen black bears hold their ground pretty impressively. I would not probably attempt to intimidate one, but I haven't had to as yet.
Oh my goodness. So it had a snack in your kitchen and left?
No, it actually broke into my aunt's bedroom.
Oh,
God.
Who knows exactly what made it decide that was the spot, except that the screen door was open.
Were there 3 beds in the bedroom and it was doing a reverse fairy tale here?
Trying to find its porridge.
Yeah, I'm not sure that was going to be the fairy tale ending. Yeah, that was a memorable incident. But of course, it's a black bear. Then you run into a grizzly bear the size of, Jeep Grand Cherokee, and it's a little bit different. Yeah.
Yeah. Or like the Kodiak bear. They are so big, And they'll sit and they look so cute and they do the little wave and everything. And then when they're in your face, it's another story.
It's a lot of nope.
Oh yeah.
No.
I don't know. I've seen them too. I get up to Alaska some. I've got family and friends up there. They are they're pretty cool.
It's so cute.
Oh,
I
they're
love them.
everywhere there.
It's so hard to be afraid of them, even though they're absolutely tremendous.
Yeah, they only have knives at the end of their appendages, and could probably
That's just garnishing.
Small
Don't
swords.
judge them.
Small swords.
Now,
Yeah.
as much as I love to bear with this
Sorry.
topic,
Oh, no dad jokes, Aaron. Oh,
Yeah.
God.
Look great.
I'm allowed one, okay? I'm allowed the one. So, basically, I'm curious though, like Andrew and Jackson, like how have the two of you actually discovered each other? Because you're both kind of in the mythical, the Norse myth, realm and stuff, but very different worlds. So I'm just kind of curious, like how did you guys find each other and start to interact with each other?
Well,
And so we discovered that I actually knew about you a pretty long time ago.
Yep.
Right, when we briefly talked about this yesterday, because I remember being in grad school in 2008 and I don't know why, I always remember years for some reason, but finding out about the fate of the Norns, and I still can't remember if I had a PDF, if I had a printed out version of one of the books. If I did, I can't find it. But so I've known about you and the fate of the Norns for at least that long, and I'm pretty sure I can pronounce your name, isn't it? Valkauskas?
Yep, that's right. Yeah,
So
Lithuanian.
that's
So it's good job. It's usually very badly butchered, especially here in Quebec. They're like, "Ooh, that's so exotic. When did you come to Quebec?" I'm like, yeah, I was born here. Thanks."
And
No, all those. I mean, that Auskas ending is so distinctively Lithuanian.
Yep, and I discovered Jackson by just by accident on YouTube. This was his early days, his very first videos I remember with the whiteboard and the markers, and I was like, where was this guy back in 91, 92 when I was learning all this stuff? Exactly. I was just like, this guy's making it so approachable, so easy. I mean, when I started Fate of the Norns, we had to do just the drudgery of going through a card catalog in a library, going to find, books in different sections and, this is not the book we're looking for. And now it's like this generation is spoiled with you, Jackson, in your videos and your Patreon. It's just, grab a bag of popcorn and just learn this beautifully.
Well, that's kind of you. Part of what I was trying to do was, the internet is kind of the library of our time. When someone wants to find out about something today, they Google it. So what I was trying to do was put better information higher up in the Google search results. I don't know to what degree exactly I've succeeded at that. And it's possible that I'm already being sort of passed by the sands of time, because now I guess even traditional websites are kind of getting bypassed by social media, which is its own kind of evolution of how information is shared. But yeah, that's really what I was going for, was let me put good information where it isn't yet. And
and I remember I emailed you with a couple of
story
questions regarding I can't remember what it was at the time. We were doing some sort of research, I think, and then I think I reached out to you again when we were starting Creatures from Fairy Tale and Myth, and I remember asking you if you knew any professors that actually really specialized in fairy tales, and you sent me to someone again. I had a migraine earlier today. My brain is like semi-functional, so
Sure.
names are not going to be on the tip of my tongue tonight. But it was very few exchanges, but meaningful exchanges. So finally, we get to meet face to face, virtually.
computer to
albeit.
computer.
yeah,
Yes.
telemeet, as I've heard it called.
Yep.
Oh no! Oh.
Lord.
Look, I know language is malleable and it's changing all the time, but there are certain things we just should not do. There are some sins we should not commit. If you're gonna
Well.
commit sins, do them well, and that is not doing it well. Honestly, I wish
Well,
I
I'm
love
not-
I think we're going to have a really good
I'm not the
conversation
inventor.
because we've got so much in common here. I mean, both of you guys are, down here I'm pointing, linguists, and over here we're like Viking aficionados, and there's so much overlap, like Aaron says. We've got audiences that are fans of the historical Vikings, the mythological Vikings, and you make great informational videos, and I love your books as well, the published books, and I can't wait to read your next one. And we end up making Viking games that are based on the research of the history and mythology. So I think we're going to have a lot of interesting discussions. What I wanted to ask you though is, from your side of things, when you started doing this academically, what was the I guess the sparking moment where you said, I really need to publish either a poem from the Poetic Edda or the Poetic in its entirety? What was that tipping point?
Well, that began with teaching Norse mythology at UCLA, because I've always had a huge emphasis on the raw primary sources. I don't want to teach you through some secondary source, some big book of Norse mythology, some big Wikipedia page of Norse mythology. I want to help you approach the original thing. And what I found was, with any given translation that I tried to use with my students, even if it was a very good translation, they would have to spend so much time with the English that they lost the thread of the story. Right? I'd have to sit there and explain this weird word or this weird poetic turn of phrase or something like that. And so I just started translating. Initially, I had no notion of publishing it as a book, but I just started publishing individual poems that they referred to a lot, right? So I started with like a Voluspa and Havamal, Lokasena, and actually did some of the big Sigurd poems after that. And what actually led to getting published was I wrote a very positive review of the translation of Beowulf by Dick Ringler, which was published by Hackett Publishing Company. And the editor thanked me, and I said, while I've got your ear, you've recently published this very, very good modern English translation of this Old English poem. How interested would you be in Old Norse? And that just sort of led to, 4 books later, I still got a great relationship with my publisher, and I've been really pleased at how well those books have done.
Very cool. And so after the Edda, you've moved on to certain sagas, and I know you've picked, Saga of Hedric the Wise. This is the version that I had on my shelf. I don't know if this was one that you looked at in terms of how it was done. This was by Tolkien, Christopher Tolkien.
Christopher Tolkien, I know he did one, yeah. I've seen that translation a long time ago. Once I decide to translate a work, I don't look at any other English translations.
Okay.
I don't want to have any of the verbiage influence mine. Yeah. Because I might look at one after I've done my translation to see if there's some really huge gaps. But in case I strike on something that's really different, I want to explore the possibility that it does say something really different than a previous translator has said. And also, I want my own style to shine through and not to have kind of those echoes of someone else's wording in my head as I go through it. You know what I mean? So yeah, I did the Poetic Edda. I followed that up with the Saga of the Volsungs, and that book includes the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok because that's basically written as a sequel to the Saga of the Volsungs. Plus, the Vikings TV show was really big, so I thought people might like to see the original Old Norse story. Then I did The Wanderer's Havamal, which is a refined translation of Havamal from my Poetic Edda translation, but includes the Old Norse text and then notes. So it's kind of a edition/translation. And then, yeah, this most recent one is Hervor and Hedrick, and also called Hedrick the Wise, and Rolf Saga Kraka, Saga of Rolf Kraki.
I was going to ask you about your translation of. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, and I was saying we have more slated to come. I have a very active program with my publishers, so this is not the end.
So 7
days. I was
going
going to ask you about your translation of Havamal, because you had said in one of your videos that specifically for this one you wanted to incorporate your grandfather's intonation and the way he spoke in into the Havamal. So I was wondering how much of your experience and just modern parlance in general do you put in versus the really dry stuff that some of us are used to? How much do you leave to interpretation, and how much do you leave to expansion of the language?
Well, so Havamal is the most complex case there because there's two translations. There's a sort of normal modern English translation, and then there's the Cowboy Havamal, which is printed as an appendix both of the Poetic Edda and the Wanderer's Havamal, and that's what's in my grandfather's voice. So I'm not presenting that as the sort of main translation, if you will. It's more of a tonal translation. It's put into English, but also sort of put the way he would put it, kind of with like a Mark Twain-ish, I dialect. It's obviously not IPA, just enough to evoke the accent a little bit. In the Wanderer's Havamal, with that newer translation of Havamal, I have notes in that book that explain specific translation choices. So that allowed me a little bit more freedom to stick a little bit closer to the original wording in places where it was vague enough that for the Poetic Edda translation where there's no notes, I would have twisted it more toward a plainer modern English rendering.
Mm-hmm.
My main goal at all times is to give you something that if you're reading from front to back, you can understand. Right? I want you to be able to read it on a bus, is how I put it. Because, I'm a huge believer in teaching what they'll learn. And I know that a lot of students are getting on the bus the day of class, and that's the first time they're going to see the readings, right?
Yes.
Well, but I think there's a value to saying, okay, I know that's how you're actually approaching this. Let me actually give it to you in a way you're going to remember, even though you read it that way, right? Because if you try to read Shakespeare that way, you're never going to understand it. So why put it in Shakespearean English? Why not put it in English someone can understand?
That's what this. I
Because
have
they're going
this
to get the cliff
translation.
notes anyways afterwards, right? So they're
This-
going to look
I
for
don't
that.
know.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say
This is the problem with Zoom.
I have this translation of the Tyne, and the way that Kieran Carson did it, he has the translation of the Book of Ulster, but then underneath each piece of the translation, he actually novelizes what's going on. And it's very interesting. It was a new take on it that I really appreciated, and I was wondering why more people didn't do it like that.
It's a nice idea.
Yeah. I mean, obviously with
I appreciate the idea. I think with a lot of skaldic poetry, that's a useful tack that I've seen done, where you present a very literal translation and then kind of a prose translation underneath that. This is what this actually says.
And that's the reason most of the people that end up approaching the Eddas usually look at the prose Edda first, because it's a little bit more accessible than the poems, if they're just straight up translations. Whereas Snorri kind of summarizes it in just easily digestible paragraphs in terms of a summary of who were the Aesir and what were their exploits and where do they live and things like that.
Yeah, at the same time, I mean, I think that's partially an artifact of translation. Translators over the years have mostly translated the prose Edda a little bit more, prosaically, and made it more approachable. Whereas translators of the Poetic Edda have tended to, I don't know, it's a text that draws people into a King James kind of English. And I think that's actually a lot of why people find it unapproachable. I think most of the poems rendered in contemporary English can be read front to back and very well followed. Not to mention that they're a lot shorter than anything Snorri says. And the poets were a lot less confused than Snorri was.
Yeah,
So,
he was
I
a
don't
little
know.
bit all over the place. It's true.
He gets befuddled sometimes and doesn't always know what to do with sources that don't agree with each other. So, I have a big affection for the Poetic Edda. I never thought... I felt like reading it in Old Norse, there's difficult Old Norse poetry. Some of it is in the Poetic Edda, but for the most part, the poems in the Poetic Edda are not in super difficult Old Norse. So, kind of like when you read the New Testament in Greek, it's not really tough Greek. So why make it in really tough English? It's kind of how I felt about it in my translations.
Okay.
I learned, I did ancient Hebrew and ancient Aramaic for 10 years. Waste of time.
Wow.
But
Oh, that's
I,
cool.
yeah, but I often found that the English translation of the ancient stuff was worse than what the ancient stuff presented, because when you're reading and you're deciphering and trying to understand, you do your own translation, as you say. And then when you look over at what they've done, you think, okay, we'll go with that. That's fine. But,
Right. No, absolutely. So, there are translations that I dislike, but there's also just translations that are good but are done in a different spirit, right? So, I mean, for example, the translation of Poetic Edda by Carolyn Larrington is excellent,
Love it.
right? It's done by someone who absolutely knows that language well, knows the content well. I mean, it's excellent, but she has a different philosophy about translating than I have. So they're two different documents,
Yep.
right? Versus there's translations from, the late 19th, early 20th century done by people who really weren't as well equipped with the language or had really weird priors that, I just think are straight up not good. So there's a difference between, just saying, well, this is a different way of looking at how to translate versus, this is done well or done badly.
I think
Now,
some
with
of them
the
were
prose
even
Edda,
interpretations, maybe even some of those older ones that are from
sure,
the
yeah.
19th century. That I've got a couple of copy of those, and when I
yeah.
looked at the Old Norse afterwards and I looked at what they wrote, I'm just like, no, this is an interpretation. They're not even close.
Yeah, or someone like Gudbrandur Vigdusson in the Corpus Poeticum Boreali, where he rearranges all of them and decides, oh, actually, the poems that we have are not actually the poems that were composed. It's actually the real poem is a third of this poem, a fifth of this poem, and a half of this poem rearranged and jumbled together.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
No, and I don't think they were working off of the original manuscripts. Right now, we're kind of lucky that we've got all these digitized manuscripts, and
It's easy.
In Iceland and whatnot. You could see the original. What are they? 5 centimeters across, those pages with the all of the text, and everything's been OCR'd for us. It's just it makes that kind of scholarship so much easier.
Yeah.
The OCR isn't always very good, but the physical scans are great. I mean, I've seen the Codex Regius, the Poetic Edda. It's about the size of a paperback book. And of course, the Árni Magnússon Institute in Iceland has made excellent scans available online. I mean, I've got the Codex Regius, the Poetic Edda on my phone.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean,
Incredible.
it means that I can just go straight to the manuscript without having to justify flying all that far, figure out where I'm going to stay, figure out what dumpster I'm going to scrounge out of in Iceland so I can, stay within some stated budget, right? It's made a huge difference.
What do you mean you don't walk around with an entire library on your back like I do? Going, oh, I have to look that
Well,
up, but I don't like this edition. I want this one, and this one is not available in digital.
I've tried that, and it can be difficult in certain environments, like, boating across lakes.
Or marching up the Rocky Mountains just to talk about the alphabet, looking over a giant vista.
Yeah, that happens too. That's if you're thinking about the alphabet video, that's the Black Canyon.
Oh, stunning! What a background.
Our famous Black Canyon. Yeah.
Speaking of translation, I wanted to ask. Now, very famously, and I don't understand how this has happened, but because this is what I wanted to ask you about. The word blue. I never understood why people thought the Vikings did not have a word for blue or light blue or dark blue or something like that. And it's interesting because in Irish, in Old Irish, it's the same. The word gorum, which means it means like a dark blue, but it got confused somewhere along the way, and gorum started being used for black. And now obviously it's flipped back, but why did that myth of Vikings not having a word for blue persist for so long?
Well, it remains, I would say, even kind of the accepted wisdom. I think that the main thing that impelled this notion that there's no blue in Old Norse is that very prominently in Old Norse poetry, ravens are called blue. And
But
so
they are. They are.
they
They
are
have
blue,
that.
right,
They
right.
have that.
That's the thing. Yeah, right. It's because they're observing them closely,
Right.
right? They are blue, right? In fact, you can find a lot of English language poets that talk about blue ravens.
Yeah.
So it's, to me, I think that it's strange. And, usually if you look at translations that always translate the word lor in Old Norse as black, right? They'll often say, notice that ravens are called blue. That means that blue actually means black, so they have two words for black instead of a word for blue and
Right.
a word for black.
Right. Yeah.
But I think that's not great reasoning. I mean, for one thing, they're using two different words, so why are they two different words? They're actually pretty consistent about what's blue and what's black, and what's blue mostly lines up pretty close with our ideas of what's blue. And I think one of the main nails in the coffin, to me, is that there's only two color terms used of human eyes in Old Norse, and those are the terms blue and black, blå and svartur. So they're contrasting something, presumably something like blue eyes and something like brown eyes, because black actually contains the brown category in Old Norse.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Svart also is for brown as well?
well, it's a categorization thing, right? So the category black is higher than the category brown. They're not separate categories like in English. It's like how in English you would say, so-and-so drives a green car.
Mm-hmm.
And then I say, well, I see two green cars. Is it the light green or the forest green?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So both of those are green to us, but they're different shades.
Right.
So in the same way, in early Old Norse, black is a category in which brown is a part. That makes sense.
So
Interesting. In
Okay.
all Irish, it's pretty similar.
if you look at like Svartalfar or Dokalfar, you've got dark and black, right? As the translations for those.
Yeah.
So is there overlap linguistically for those two words? Are they two different Alfar or the
Well,
Spi?
No, I think they're the same thing, if they're even all that different from elves in the first place, which is a whole vexed question. I mean, with that, it's the same as like how in English you would say it's a dark night and it's a black night and mean the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So with, the Dukalvar, Svartalvar distinction, the person who really makes a big deal out of that is Snorri.
Oh, and this guy over here, Jakob Grimm. Yeah.
Oh,
Also,
well, he makes a big deal out of everything and, throws it all into a pot and decides everything is symbolic of this, that, or the other.
Yeah.
Loki is fire and blah, 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 and Orkney and Saga is somehow crux of everything. Anyway, yeah, Grimm is interesting. So if you look at the Poetic Edda, if you just read the Poetic Edda without reading the Prose Edda or any secondary literature,
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't actually get you wouldn't have a sense that the elves or any subdivisions of elves are really all that important. I mean, you would run into a place like Lokasena where you hear the gods and the elves are dining. It never actually says who the elves are there, but they might be the gods' servants who are there.
But they talk about
You would find
Alfheim,
that.
Alfheim and Svartalfheim as two realms, right?
So
And they
in the poetic Edda, I think the only mention of Alfheimr is when we hear in Grímnismál that Freyr was given Alfheimr as a teething gift, whatever exactly that means. It's Snorri who really makes this sound important and makes it sound systematic.
distinct. Yep.
Right. He talks about, Alfheimr as this sort of separate realm, Svartalfheimr as a separate realm, the elves and the dark elves as being separate things. It's interesting that when he talks about the making of Mjolnir, he actually uses the term, I can't remember if he says Svartalfr or Dukalfr, but it's one of those, and then dwarves in like within two sentences of each other about the same people.
Yep. And Nidavellir is
So-
mentioned for their location too, right? For the Dvergar when they're mentioned.
Well, the dwarves seem to just sort of be anywhere, right? There's some on Midgard, there seem to be some kind of with the gods.
Mm-hmm.
Dwarves seem to be kind of scattered all over the place. But what I've generally wondered, well, I think if you want a good scholarly overview of all these questions with elves and dwarves and such, the person to look to is Armand Jakobsson at the University of Iceland.
Oh, yeah.
He has done incredible work. I can type that somewhere if you need me to.
Sure, we'll put it at the bottom of the video
I've actually-
after.
Okay.
Aaron, figure out how to spell it quick.
No.
Yeah. Armand Jakobsson. So I actually have a great. He did a crowdcast with me and my Patreon supporters where I answered a lot of questions about monsters and such in Old Norse. But to hopefully not do injustice to his idea, he sees elf as a really broad term that encompasses any lesser supernatural being that isn't malignant. So it's not really a species. It's like kind of a general designation for lesser supernatural creature that isn't bad.
Like a
Right.
sprite.
And it's opposed. Well, so it would include dwarf, but dwarf is its own thing. But then that explains the confusion of dwarf and elf, right? Because elf is sort of this higher. This is kind of like what I was saying with color. Elf is kind of this higher category that's fairly vague, but within that category, there's a more specific category of dwarf.
Did he put the Vaetier
so-
in with the Alfar?
I think so, to the extent that we even know what those are. You know, some of this stuff is so vague in the primary sources. Right? I mean, you know, like what you're talking about gets mentioned in, for example, Landnámabók, where we read about in the old heathen laws how you're not supposed to have the
Dragon head.
the dragon on
In
your
front of
the
your
dragon
ship.
head on your ship because it might scare the Landvættir. And then in Egil Saga, where he calls on the Landvættir to drive King Eric Bloodaxe and Gunhild out of Norway.
Yep.
So, but those are such vague mentions that, you know, I can't draw
Yeah.
the Landvættir for you.
In my space, though, game design, using all of these mythological sources, this is all kind of like stuff that I plumb out of these sources, even if they're mentioned once or twice. And for me, when I ended up looking at the dwarves and the Alfar, they could very much be the same species, but they could also be separate, as Snorri paints them. And for me, I had to make a call in terms of a game world, Fate of the Norns universe. Are they going to be the same or different species? And we went with a different species that gives added richness, added stories that we could tell with
Sure.
these various species. Yeah.
And that's absolutely your prerogative.
Yeah.
You know, I understand some of that myself. When I was in, well, like late elementary through college years, I did a lot of RPGs, right? You know, I encountered a lot of this. I know about, you know, stats for this, that, and the other.
Yep.
But to approach the real medieval mythology, I think it's important for us to distinguish between what modern storytellers and game designers are doing with it and what it actually says if you just read it as is and don't bring those modern preconceptions and categories with you. Now, to do that, you know, can be a challenge because we do have so many modern preconceptions. We do, you know, we do think of dwarves and elves as beings with, you know, a different amount of hit points from each other.
Scottish accents for dwarves.
Don't get me started.
Right, it's Scottish accents. Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's a major thing. So, you know, sometimes I think you just have to drink 20 cups of coffee and then read the Poetic Edda before, you know, you can sort of blitz all of the modern preconceptions out of your head.
Yeah.
But once you do, it's actually interesting how different it is and how vague it is in some ways.
It is, and there's a lot of contradictions and omissions as well. Like one of the things that really bugged me as, you know, again, game designer and trying to, you know, put everything in its proper category are the various words that they used for giants and ogres and trolls and whatnot. And, you know, for the various translations, again, if we go back to the translations and the willy-nilly use of, you know, words like flagged and gifr and risi and jotnar and thurs, those were all used like interchangeably. You know, sometimes thurs would be translated to a troll, another time it would be, you know, an ogre or a giant. And this is one of those things that I just wanted in my Edda to have, you know, a clean mapping of each one of those,
Right.
and to make sure that, you know, a Jotun will be a Jotun in our world, and, you know, a Risi is going to be, you know, a smaller giant like an ogre. So.
And it's interesting because these terms, you know, they interplay They overlap. Again, if I may lean on Armand Jakobsen, he paints troll as a term that's more or less opposed to elf. It's minor supernatural creature that's malignant. But troll is also used of a lot of human beings. So in fact, very often in the sagas we find, a human being who's called the troll because, he or she uses magic in a negative way, or even just because he or she's ugly.
Troll-blooded, yeah.
Right? But you just see that old troll, right? Because it's just some unattractive person. Jotun is more of a species designation, but I hesitate even to say species designation because they're the same species as the god.
Yep.
As the gods, it's sort of like a family, as the Jotnar. Thor seems to be about the same thing, but Thor is more negative in connotation. Risi is more like literally giant, right? Like literally a very large being. And that term gets used more and more in later Old Norse. You don't see that much in the Eddas. I can't remember a specific instance of it in the Eddas. But of course, then you do have these weird translation concerns there because Jotun, Thurs, Risi, even Troll might just be translated giant by someone, right? In addition to 8 other terms that might come up for alliteration and other purposes like that. When I started doing these translations, I just went with giant in my translation of the Poetic Edda because that's what everyone did, and I couldn't see a good way around it. So I went with that with misgivings and a lot of notes in the introduction and the glossary about how they're not actually bigger than the god. They're not weird blue beings. For my class in Norse mythology that I did for the Great Courses, which isn't out yet, but it will be in November, December. I actually tried out the term anti-god, which I think is a somewhat useful term for the Jotuns. It reminds you that their status is very similar to the gods. It kind of eliminates the sort of alien seemingness of a term like giant. But we'll see if anybody likes that.
Interesting. It's the same.
It was an experiment.
It's the same in the Irish nomenclature as well when they talk about things like the two a day and then the Philbog, and then there are so many different, and then the Fianna. There's so many different ones. And you think, well, are they all gods? Because it says this one is a god and then that one's a spirit and this. So you don't really, you have to do your best, and I guess maybe demigod or at least in the Irish terms.
But some of them could be,
Right.
killed by mortals and whatnot.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of, slippery slopes. And in the Irish, there's also, the goblins and the fae, right? Fairies and goblins that could be, these umbrella terms that we're talking about, like Alfar or Troll.
Well, there's the Dinashi and all that stuff, and trooping fairies, non-trooping fairies.
Well, but I also think, and this is the result of drinking 20 cups of coffee often before contemplating these things, that terms like, whatever we might want to use, goblin, ogre, giant, whatever, we think of those as something you can put into a monster manual and give a charisma, strength, and an intelligence score to, right? But I'm not sure, but what for a lot of medieval poets, these terms were much more akin to a term like, I'm just going to use the first one that comes to mind, like bastard. In as much as you might call me a bastard or you might not, it might mean something very literal and not profane, like I'm an illegitimate son, or it might just be an insult. Whether you would use that insult about me or not depends on what you think of me, what our past interactions have been or not. But I'm not necessarily objectively something that can be given stats as a bastard.
Exactly.
Right? So,
You say that.
I don't think these... Well, maybe the stats you can use, but I don't think that you could then go and make an RPG supplement about 2021 and give, class stats for bastard. Right? I'm not sure that it's actually a term that has...
It's been done.
That has...
Yeah.
Well, but I'm not sure that the term really has like descriptive categorical meaning.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think the same is true of a lot of these monster works.
Yeah, it would be
is I
more
guess
like
what I'm
an
getting at.
archetype. It would be, well, yeah, an archetype of
Archetype is a possibility. It's in, you know, I think medieval storytellers just weren't as concerned with, all of these things we worry about with like what's canon or not, what contradicts something or not. We're comfortable with canon getting weird around some types of characters in some media, right? James Bond is a great example, right? There's not really continuity between the stories in the different James Bond movies, but the character has continuity, right? He's
Yeah.
the same
Yeah.
guy, even if he looks different, it's played by someone completely different. So I think a lot of times our mythical characters, gods, heroes, dwarves, are kind of James Bonds, where their stories are not necessarily canonically interlinked in one chronological sequence from one to the next, and can't even contradict each other. But there's still a pretty consistent portrayal of, who this person is, personality.
Andrew and I were talking about that before you jumped on, because I was talking about Njal Saga and how you had mentioned as well in one of your videos about it that it talks very briefly about the Battle of Clontarf. And in the Ulster Annals, on the Irish side, it's interesting to see how those two, Njal Saga and the Book of Ulster, are almost identical, but they come at things from completely different sides, and therefore they have completely different historical context meaning. So, for example, in Njal Saga, Gormla, what's her name in Njal Saga, Andrew? Is it Cormlu or Lau? Cormlau?
Come Lau.
And but she's but Gormla on the Irish side is just a queen who ended up going from one king to another, to another, to another. And just because of how everything is mapped out family-wise, it looks a little bit suspicious because she's, going around to first her son and then the king that wins and then the king that doesn't win. But for Njal Saga, they make her into this witch who has a cauldron and she moves everything and does everything by magic. And I think that's very interesting that even though Njal Saga is technically later than the Book of Ulster, that it adds more of that fantasy element in it. And I was wondering, what do you think of so in terms of sagas and even the events mentioned in the Eddas, how much do you think is good for historical context, and why do you think that there is such a dichotomy even within the Norse sphere? Why is it that is it just a case of broken telephone, or do you really think that there's some historical value? Because when I read something, let's say like Gildas, and you think, oh, okay, he's going through all the kings, he's giving dates, this makes sense, this looks historical, and then suddenly Merlin is at Stonehenge with a giant, and you think,
why not?
okay, maybe not. So how much historical value do you think that this has?
Right. Well, when you talk about the witch, by the way, I think that's something that's pretty common in the sagas when you have foreign women having some place of prominence. They can end up with exotic characteristics like being a witch. That doesn't strike me as all that unusual in saga literature.
Okay.
I think about what's her name? Wheat, the wife.
Queen Gunhild?
Gunhild, yeah, I mean, she's Norwegian, but I guess she's raised with the Sami, the same with Queen Wheat and the saga of Hrolf Kraki. So that's not all that unusual.
Nope.
As far as the saga's historical value goes, I'm not on either extreme. I feel like there's a need to choose one extreme or the other, right? These are basically historical documents, or these are basically fiction. I feel like there's a lot of middle ground there that says that sure, some of the basic events in these sagas probably echo distantly something that really happened, but they've been reworked so much and reworked into such a literary frame that it's not like you can go perform a CSI investigation of whatever battle they describe somewhere, right? That's not going to happen.
Well, on the archaeological side, sometimes there is evidence, but very little. I mean, Dark Ages is pretty tough.
It depends on the the genre of saga, right? When you're talking about like the king sagas, like Heimskringla, or some of the bishop sagas, they're talking about recent enough events and countries that they know well enough, and they're really trying to make it historical, especially a writer like Snorri, that or Aris Thorgilsson and Islandingabok, that you can. I would say that leans more toward being history than fiction. But I would say with the Fornaldarsögur on the other extreme, right, like Volsunga Saga, Saga Kraki, etc. Yes, even if there's actual historical events underlying this is mostly literary. But sometimes there's really surprising historical roots. I mean, Jordanes talks about Ammius and Sarus taking vengeance for their sister Sunilda on King Ermanaricus, and they're assisted by a witch Guthruna. And all of those names are the same as the names that Mutatis Mutandis, Latinized Gothic versus Old Norse.
Yeah.
They're the same as the names you find in Hamnesmal in the Poetic Edda or later in the Saga of the Volsungs. So I think to say that there's some historical, mote of dust that has a huge literary pearl built up around it, I think that's a fairly realistic perception, but I'm not going to call the pearl historical, if you will.
But I think it really depends on which sagas we're talking about. Some of them from the Icelandic bodies of work, we could say those are a lot closer to historical sagas because people can actually trace to events, to families, to lineages from multiple sources that can corroborate these. Then you can get into the heroic sagas, and so like Saga of the Volsungs would be one of them, where you're talking about Fafnir the dragon and hordes of treasures gathered by the gods that are definitely
It's real.
not
What are you talking about?
Right. Well, but that's what I said. Is
a big
those
spectrum.
mythical sagas like Volsungs
Right.
are way on the literary side. Then more on the historical side, you have king sagas, bishop sagas. The sagas of Icelanders are in the middle of that, but I would actually still say they lean toward the literary side. Yes, they may have a little mote of dust of historical truth in them, but I would still think it's mostly turned into literary fiction since then. Yes, people sometimes trace ancestry through the sagas. Yes, some of that could be true, but it doesn't always agree, right? You don't have always agreement about who settled where and who was whose father between the two sagas or between one saga.
For sure, you could tell.
Right,
the winners tell the tales.
Well, and more than winners, the good storytellers tell the tale, right? I mean, you can observe that even inside living generations of a family, where complicated relatives can become much more simply related just in the course of trying to make a story a little bit smoother in retelling, right? So someone goes from being some peripheral character in like one of your own family stories, because I see this happen in my own, goes from being Jack's third cousin to like, oh yeah, Jack's brother or whatever, like just to glide over having to explain how somebody's related. Add that stuff up over generations, and yeah, you're not going to wind up with exact literal truth. And I would say you're going to wind up with a lot more fiction than reality in it, actually.
How much do you think?
But it depends again on genre and specific saga and specific writer.
Yeah, because we're doing the graphic novel for Erbiga Saga for the next Kickstarter, and that one definitely you can tell like there's an editorial slant on who the protagonists are, and who the writer favors and who they don't favor. Which family is in the right and which family's in the wrong. But it's also got that kind of mix of saga. Historical stuff, but it's also got this wild stuff of like undead showing up for a big party at a house and they won't leave until they're sued. And it's got undead seals and Draugr and witches and all the good stuff that will make for an awesome graphic novel.
That's all true.
I call it the Zombie Outbreak Saga.
Yeah. Awesome.
It's the Zombie Outbreak Saga. I don't know how that's never been made into a movie.
It's fantastic. That's our first one. So
that's right. It's too creative.
After we release
they can't do anything with it.
We'll probably go downhill after that. We're starting with the best one.
They're trying to get the guy who directed Lord of the Rings. That's why they're working out the book deal and all that as well. So
Peter Jackson, you mean?
That's it. I'm
That'd be
bad with
interesting to
names,
see.
so thank you.
Oh, it's fine. Oh, look, I mean, he doesn't even have that anymore. Now that belongs to Amazon. So maybe he'll be in for the market now.
Maybe.
All right,
So
that's right.
I
I'm
know.
actually curious though, since both you and Andrew have kind of done your own translations of the Edda, what would you say was one of the biggest challenges of doing that? And just kind of what goal did you set out to translate? Like I know you said you were trying to have your unique voice, so that's why you kind of avoid other people's material. But I think that's just your writing style in general. But the Edda specifically for the both of you, what would you say that would have been?
Well, I know pretty well what is going to make academics mad. I know what's going to make students mad. I know what's going to make fanboys and fangirls on the internet mad. I know what's going to make, I fairly know, okayish, I guess, what's going to make, modern Norse pagans Austur mad. And I try to
Make them all mad at the same time.
Equally.
Well, I try to not care about it, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the thing is it's there in my head. I'm kind of thinking, yeah, X, Y, or Z won't like the way this is put here, but I try not to troll anyone, and I try to be as literal as I can, without also having a boring style, right? I want to translate kind of plainly, but when I say plain, I don't mean boring. I don't mean unadorned. I mean, I want you to be able to pretty plainly see what's on the page. And if you know Old Norse, to be able to see pretty clearly, why I chose one thing or another. Of course, having the notes and the Wanderers of all helped with that. I don't have notes in the other translations because it just bulks up a volume too much for the purposes they're being printed for. It's never going to be perfect. Right, I look back at any given translation. If I've had more than 5 minutes since I last typed it, which is all of them now, I can go back and say, yeah, I could have put that better.
That's any
But
book.
that's a second
It's a
printing,
writing
third
struggle,
printing,
yeah.
fourth printing. I mean, Caroline's on her fifth printing, I think, of her translation.
Yeah, you can't be a perfectionist about it because you don't get anything done if you're a perfectionist. But I do try to do right by my audience, whichever particular audience group they happen to be from when they pick it up.
For me, it was more. I think I had a lot of friends that wanted to get the right Norse myths. They wanted to get the authentic stories. There we go. Aaron was probably one of my friends that said, "Hey, can I borrow a translation of one of your Eddas? Just give me something off your shelf." And I would give him one of the professor's translations. And a week later, next gaming session, my friends show up with the book, just bleary-eyed, going I can't read this. It cured my insomnia. It wasn't working. So I'm not an academic, but I love this stuff. I read, every single source that comes across my path. And for me, it was all about creating an authentic version of the Eddas, but also making them as accessible as possible to people who are not academics. So people that just want to get the realistic stories, but told in a prose that's almost reads like a novel. So, like the Voluspa, it's not going to be a translation of line for line, word for word. It is going to be embellished by a scene of describing how Odin is sitting across from the Cirrus and setting a scene and going into his motivations in terms of why he wants to know the future of what's going to be happening, all of that, but also putting every single one of those words from Old Norse into that chapter to make sure that all of that content is there. And just like any kind of mythology, it's going to be fragmented. There's stuff that's going to be missing. So, for example, if we look at Helgi and Sigrun. Geez, my migraine just completely wiped my brain.
I can't help you on this one, Andrew.
Helgskvida. I'm probably pronouncing it horribly.
The three
Yeah.
The three Helgi poems?
Yeah, the three Helgi poems, right? So the last one is missing, right? With they say Kara will return, Kara the Valkyrie, right? And so
it says at the end of the last one, at the end of the third one, that Helgi and Sigrun are reborn,
Yeah.
and it says this is told in a poem called, I think, Karolio, and then we don't have Karolio.
Exactly. And I absolutely love that story arc. And so I added other chapters in my Edda that basically filled in those holes, because a lot of people would be like, well, what happens? What happens to these characters? Why do these characters hate each other? So I put different borders around chapters that were my own creation that kind of fill in those gaps. And then I put in a different border around chapters that were translations that were as close as possible to the original sources, with obviously prose embellishments around that. So that was kind of my goal for mine, and that was kind of the challenge, was to present this in a meta story arc, I guess, that you can read from chapter 1 to the end, so from the creation myths all the way to Ragnarok, and have a seamless story rather than disparate stories that you kind of have to thread together. Because for me as well, being selfish and going, I need this as a secondary source as well for our Fate of the Norns universe, right? So when I hire authors and game designers, this is kind of our foundation, our Bible of the Fate of the Norns universe. So it includes, all of the core material from what we know, the manuscripts, but it also has all of the blanks filled in. So we have a seamless universe that works, breathes, and lives and evolves. So that was my challenge.
You've done nothing that Irish monks haven't done. let me just put my little 2 cents in the corner here.
With a different
Yeah,
order.
it's a different project.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously with mine, I'm not trying to change the order of anything. I'm not trying to go from beginning to Ragnarok. I am just trying to follow the poems as they're there. I don't add. Each in the Poetic Edda translation, I have a little introduction to kind of give you some context, set the scene a little bit, and I will, phrase things in such a way that I think that a 21st century reader will find it natural English. But for the most part, I'm trying to stick identifiably close to the stanza that's there in Old Norse, if you find it in Old Norse.
No, I find you did a very good job of that. That's why it's one of my go-tos here on my shelf. I love it.
I appreciate it. It's there's always different things people can emphasize. Famously, Lee Hollander in his translation, which has been so popular for so long, tried to duplicate the poetic characteristics of the original, which is a really difficult project.
It's ambitious.
And it's ambitious, but it's so difficult to do in English and sound natural. And of course, he doesn't want to sound natural. He uses pre-Chaucerian English.
Doesn't age well.
But it's interesting. Well, I mean, it was already something dug out of a crypt when he wrote it in like the 1960s.
Yeah.
But but it's a different priority. Some translators actually can do that and write something that sounds pretty natural. Actually, I've got to hand it to Dick Ringler's translation of Beowulf, which is what connected me with my publisher initially. He writes in such a way that his modern English translation does kind of duplicate the poetic structure of the Old English, but does not sound weird or archaic. I've always thought that was a real triumph.
Yeah.
He's a very talented man.
I was gonna say I think I have that. That's the one I have on my shelf. It's the giant volume where it has the original text on one side and then his translation on the other.
Ringler's does not have the
No, not that one.
English, I don't believe.
So I have something similar then, I guess, where it's somebody who has the original text on one side and then the translation, but then down the center, they actually make something that would imitate the Old English. It's West Saxon dialect of Old English. So, but it follows the rhyming scheme I should say, the poetic scheme that the original text does. Very interesting.
Well, keep in mind that if you get a graduate degree that focuses on Old English, you're actually implanted with a tiny chip that will explode within 30 years if you don't publish a translation of Beowulf. So who knows which specific one that is.
Oh, please don't wish a graduate degree on me. I have too many languages, too many certificates, and I don't need another one in Old English. I was actually talking about Andrew before we came on, talking about how it's so infuriating that for how much we have of all the Irish stuff and how much we have for all the North stuff, we have so little of the Old English
Yep.
equivalency.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's accidents of preservation. And of course, Simon Roper is a great person to talk to about this. But I like Beowulf. I like a lot of the smaller poems too. There's a rich variety of Old English literature. It's just not mythic in the same way that the Old English literature is.
It would just be so nice to have that perspective where, we have the same events from one side and the other. I would like to have the events from the middle. And it's
Sure.
just so
Well,
annoying that we don't.
Who knows what's hiding in the Vatican Library archives? I mean, there's just so many like old manuscripts that just haven't been picked up and translated into modern
Oh,
English.
we know what's there, Andrew. It's
Yeah.
all the hagiographies. It's all the fan fiction.
Well,
All the same.
Who knows? I'll never say never. Something else, something new could be discovered.
it's kind of like Lithuanian mythology. It's something that just doesn't exist in English. Try to find an English book on Lithuanian mythology. It's almost impossible. There's a couple of new ones that have just come out in the last couple of years, and they're just tiny little things of 32 pages or whatnot. All the big volumes that I've got a couple of them on my back shelf. They're all in Lithuanian, and that's another great mythology that's ready to be plumbed for amazing stories. Comic books, movies, all of that. But it's also
That's cool stuff.
it's interesting because Lithuania was the last country to become a Christian country in all of Europe. This was like 1100, and so they retained their pagan roots the longest. However, there was the least amount in terms of written down by monks in terms of preservation. Most of that was burnt in the centuries afterwards. So it's kind of like a ironic situation in the end.
It's super sad to hear.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie. Like, don't
Actually,
burn.
Well, but it's rich stuff. What I've seen of what remains, and it's cool how late some of it is.
Yeah, the last couple of kings, the pagan kings, they kind of switched over to Christianity, but it didn't take it took several kings to finally for it to stick. It's pretty funny in the history books. They were like they switched for a weekend, and it's just back by Monday they're sacrificing again.
But they got bored.
Well, everyone thinks that conversion can happen from top down instantly, and it can.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, when you're talking about it doesn't matter what religion or ideology you're talking about. It doesn't happen like that.
Nope.
So yeah, there's always going to be some interesting elements at the grassroots.
How much of the Gothic stuff do we have? Because I know in terms of language, we've got a pretty decent amount for Gothic, but even like Vandalic, we don't have that much. And why is it that, I mean, even though they supposedly came from around the same part of the world, why is the language so different?
Oh, that's mostly an accident of when it's preserved from. If you're looking at Gothic as presented in a textbook of the Gothic language, you're looking at the language of the 300s.
Right.
Whereas if you're looking at a textbook of Old Norse, you're looking at the language of the 1200s.
Yeah.
If you looked at Proto-Norse at the same time as Gothic, they would look very, very similar.
Okay.
It's just that Old Norse has had another several hundred years of development. The languages are actually very close. There's not a lot of mythic material in Gothic, certainly not in the Gothic language, but there is some stuff written about the Goths, sometimes by Goths, generally in Latin, that does have a little bit of mythic material. So there's a little bit in Jordanes, a little bit in Paul the Deacon. This, I guess, strictly talking about the Lombards, but another East Germanic tribe. There's little bits there, but there's not very much. And of course, that could also be some accidents of preservation. There's an extra 1,000 years there for stuff to get lost.
Yeah.
But also, we have to remember it's not like today where any one of us, before the clock strikes midnight, could write a book and, make it into a PDF and put it on Amazon. Creating any sort of written material, especially long written material, before the printing press, especially before the internet, is tough. So people just didn't take the time to write down a lot of this. And a lot of ancient cultures didn't think of writing as prestigious. right? Why write down the stories that you tell around the campfire than the stories you tell around the campfire, right?
Yeah, if everybody
Why
knows
are you
them, then
writing this
why
down?
would you write it? Yeah, exactly.
Right, and then the Christian missionaries aren't going to want to write it down while people are still potentially attached to the old religion. Because
No,
why would you write
they're
down the
too
stuff?
busy. They're too busy making fan fiction about their own saints.
Right. Well, and why would you want to write down the stuff? Yeah, people forget how much of that there is.
Yeah.
Why would you want to write down this? Why would you want to write down the stuff that you're trying to get people to stop believing it?
Yeah.
Right. It's a place like Iceland where, for many generations people have already been converted, where there's a certain cultural confidence that the people around you are truly Christian, that you can show an antiquarian interest in that stuff. Right. But there's no antiquarian interest while there are still people to be converted.
But even then,
So,
Snorri
yeah,
ended up having that little preface to kind of like wash his hands of it, where he said, "Oh, these are not really gods that I'm going to be writing about. These are heroes that came from faraway lands, and let me just write this little preface so you don't burn me at the stake, and then now let me launch into all this
Well,
material."
I don't think anyone was getting burned at the stake for this in Iceland anyway. But it's a standard of medieval piety. Saxo Grammaticus does it too. These aren't really gods. But of course, it's just something you do to show where what your face-up cards are, and furthermore, from a medieval perspective, it's good scholarship.
Yeah.
Right. They're stating their priors, and they're also, when Snorri is trying to connect the Norse gods to the Trojans, yes, it's pretty ridiculous, but by the medieval standard, it was actually a pretty good work of scholarship because everyone had to make their claim about who the Trojans were, and there was a pretty rich medieval tradition of claiming, oh, the Trojans are us, whoever us is, right?
Yeah.
Whether that was the British, the Albanians, the Norse gods, whatever.
It's exactly the same in the Labor Gabal and Ahiran. Like the first pick is, these are the lost tribes of Israel, and one of them is us. And you think,
Right.
yeah. I mean,
no. Well, I mean, everyone does this. It's pseudo-scholarship, but the impulse is maybe not so different from the impulse of a lot of group identification today, right? People want to be associated with the glorious past. How many people have logged on to Ancestry.com and now powerfully identify as French royalty or whatever because, they're the 57th.
Given all their DNA to
that test, that test worked out perfectly.
Yeah. Right. So, I mean, it's something people want to do. They want to identify with in a pseudo-scholarly way with a glorious past that's documented elsewhere.
Speaking of which, I actually wanted to ask you about what do you think about the new Nynorsk movement? Oh, sorry, Nynorn. There's a new movement of people who want to revive the Norn language, and I think it's interesting because in Shetland, I think they wrote down about 10,000 words, and in Orkney they have a couple of more thousand. But I don't know. And you had said that you just you joined, was it the Scots Society, some sort of Scots Society?
That's true.
I mean, granted that's a completely different language, or dialect. I know I'm going to get shot for saying either one, so who cares? But what do you think it's possible to revive Norn? 'Cause, I mean, yeah, sure, we've revived languages like Hebrew and things like that before, and even Manx is now having a huge revival. But with no grammatical structure, do you think it's possible?
I think Norn is fun. It's a if you look at the material that survives from Shetland and Orkney, if you showed it to me without me having ever heard of Norn and said, "What is this?" I would say it's a pretty interesting dialect of Norwegian.
Okay.
Right. I mean, it's really not terribly different from, say, Faroese or some southwestern Norwegian dialects. It's recognizably within the continuum of developments in those languages. I got pretty interested in Norn in like 2012, 2013. I followed this rabbit hole, chasing all this stuff down. It's very neat. I understand the fascination with it. I have no idea how to revive a language. I have all the influence of a box turtle, so I am not exactly a
Honestly,
choice leader for such.
I don't think anybody knows how to do that properly. I mean, when you've studied somebody like me, when I studied ancient Hebrew for so long, I thought, oh, modern Hebrew's going to be fine then. I'll be fine. Oh no,
It's not that way yet.
no.
Well,
So
it's like the people who learn Old Norse and think they can have a conversation in Iceland. It's like, well, you're able to read a lot of things, but
it's pretty close.
you're
I mean,
not ready for.
It's pretty close. You did that panel, was it on the Econolinguist, where it was one
Yeah,
Icelander, somebody from was it Sweden or somebody Danish?
It was an Icelander, a Dane, and a Norwegian. But also
Okay.
note, he understood the Old Norse better than someone who knows Old Norse would understand modern Icelandic. Right? It doesn't necessarily go perfectly
Both
symmetrically both ways. Because the Old Norse is pronounced in such a way that you easily recognize it from the spelling in Icelandic. Right? Icelandic spelling is very conservative. The changes to pronunciation in modern Icelandic don't track with the spelling. So an Old Norse speaker, even a literate one, wouldn't necessarily have a basis for understanding why things are being pronounced the way they were. And then the colloquialisms are totally different, right? Like you don't say. Basically, all you've done is read Norse Eddas and Sagas. You don't know how to say, how's it going in Icelandic, and is it laundry night? And by the way, what's the cheapest restaurant in Reykjavik? Which is doesn't exist.
There isn't one.
But
That's a trick question.
But how do you So there's you aren't ready for the colloquial stuff if you've only done Old Norse.
Oh yes, I know that one well. Oh,
So, going into one of our other questions here, Michelle, we have a question from you actually about the.
actually, yeah, this is a perfect segue because I wanted to ask about naming, and why is it that in either old in Icelandic and in Faroese they seem to use dottir, but I don't think that's used in any of the other Norse languages.
It used to be.
Oh, was it? Okay, I didn't know.
Yeah. So in the medieval period, all last names were patronyms throughout Scandinavia, and in fact, in rural parts of Norway and Sweden, especially, you could find 20th century people with last names like that. Right. So, for example, the early 20th century Norwegian writer Arne Garborg was born. I can't remember his dad's name, but he was born as like Arne Haraldsson or whatever his dad's name was. So there are actually a lot of places that maintain that tradition pretty late. So yeah, your last name is your dad's name and son or dottir. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. I didn't realize that because I noticed it in a lot of Icelandic and Faroese names, and then I didn't see it anywhere else. So when I'm looking for names for characters, I have to look at the geography of certain things, and I wanted a specific character to misspell his name and accidentally take the name of his mother instead of his father, and so that's where I got that from.
Well, so what's interesting there is there's not really an error there, right? You actually do find people who are known by their mothers as their mother's son rather than as their father's son, right? So, for example, Thor is known as Thor, Odin's son, right? Because he's son of Odin. So, but Loki is Loki, Lavoir's son, and Lavoi is his mom. Right? He's never called Loki Forbatta's son for his dad. He's always called Loki Lavoir's son of his mom, Lavoi. That probably has to do with the fact that she's higher status as a god rather than as a Jotun. And also it alliterates with his name, Loki, Lavoir's son. But you find people in the sagas who do that too. And in modern Iceland, you can choose to use your mom's name. So, if my dad is Jon, I can call myself Jonsson, but maybe I don't like my dad. Maybe I don't know who my dad is. Maybe I just identify more with my mom, or I want to associate more with my mom's family. If her name is, Sigrun, I can call myself Sigrun, our son. That's fine. right? And especially in the medieval period, there's no legal reality to it, right? There's no county courthouse where you record the name at birth.
Yeah.
That last name is just a descriptor, right? It's just a way of saying I'm not that Hrolver, I'm Hrolver so and so's son.
Right.
And if so and so, and if the person you're talking to knows who your mom is but not who your dad is, you might well just use your mom's name, right? I'm Hrolver Sigrunar's son instead of Hrolver, Jon's son. Or whatever.
And it would have been much more fluid back then because there was no ID that you needed to print or show. So yeah, you can go whichever way you want, whenever the wind blew.
Well, but
Yeah.
for-
So I would argue there's not really errors in these names as long as you're correct about who your parents are.
No, I meant that for this particular character that I had, he made an error in that he has the last name Daughter.
Oh, that would be an error.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the
That's the point.
misadventure.
Because he doesn't understand. Yeah,
Yes,
right.
so
Because he
he's-
doesn't understand that it's
Yeah, he has no
literally
idea.
daughter.
His mother died, but he knows that this was his mother's name, so he just took that name, not realizing it doesn't belong to a
I
guy.
see.
It should be
Yeah.
changed.
I
Yeah.
see.
Yeah.
Doesn't realize that it's a descriptor of literally who her dad was.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Well, and,
No.
that happens too all the time when people from outside of Iceland encounter Icelandic names. They assume that they're inherited surnames.
Mhm.
But family of four. The cliche example is like a family of four from Iceland checking into a hotel, and the host says, "Well, what's the last name of the party?" They might have four
Four
different
different names. Yeah.
Interesting.
So we touched on Loki there for a second, and I think I want to open up a can of worms from one of your videos about the association with fire. In one of the, I guess more, esoteric sources, he goes under a different name, which is Lopt. And there's a story with him and Sinmara and the sword Levtain. So in this case, he has like an association that's kind of like once removed from Surt. And when we first started doing some of the research early on for the earlier edition, we were looking at his siblings. And when we found kennings for his siblings, they were used for fire, for different types of... one was for charcoal, and another one was for a campfire. And I can't remember which was Bylist or Helblindi. But this was one of those sources. I think when you and I talked, I was saying we were using a university library for this. And one of the other interesting things that we found, and this was in a completely more modern book on, I think it was Old Icelandic, they were mentioning that the word Loki was brought in for a term when dealing with, when you've got that kind of mirage over a camp, like over a fire, when you've got that heat dissipation, or when you've got a morning dew that's being evaporated in the morning. That Loki was one of the words, or part of the word in that phrase that was being used. Now, this is so long ago that I can't bring up the sources. I wish I could, but this is not the going to the Logi, which is when they have that eating competition in the Jotun Olympics, when Loki has to compete with fire. We didn't go in terms of that kind of confusion between Logi and Loki, nor did we go to the Wagnerian associations that ended up happening with the Ring of the Nibelungs. But these were like other sources that we had found, and I wanted to bring this up because I don't know how extensive the kennings are, because they went beyond what we had found in the Prose Edda with Snorri. There were several other books that were published that we had found in the libraries that dealt with extended kennings, and his siblings ended up having those kinds of associations. And I don't know if you had crossed anything like that.
Nope. So a lot of
Shortest answer.
first of all, I'd be pretty suspicious of kennings for super obscure deific figures, especially ones that don't come from Snorri. We know zero about Loki's brothers except their names.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We hear Hellblindi, which is something like Hellblind, and then Beleifter or Belaster. It depends on the exact manuscript. That would be something like a Befoot or Bee Survivor. If you know what does that mean, right? It may not even be preserved right.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I would say that it's probably not preserved right because it's preserved in two forms, and we don't know who this guy is. I've never seen a kenning for either one of them or anything to associate either one of them with fire. Part of what creates this association with fire in so many works in the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries is Jakob Grimm got really obsessed with the Loki fire connection. Like, really obsessed with it if you read Deutsche Mythology.
Oh, no, I didn't see it in that source.
He takes the whole... First of all, you mentioned the eating contest of Loki versus Loki fire.
Yeah.
He takes Loki flame as Loki and then identifies Loki with basically anywhere else the word Loki occurs. And so there's a really obscure early part of Orkney Saga, the saga of the people of Orkney, where we hear about this ancient king who has three sons, and one of them is Logi, and one of them is Flare, and one of them is something else, but it kind of roughly ends up being like fire, water, and wind. And so Grimm spins this whole thing out of that about who these people really are, and I mean, it's 18 levels of speculation.
Mm-hmm.
But if you just read the Eddas, you would never, in your remotest dreams, get the notion that Loki had something to do with fire.
So, the association with
the one
Loft.
time... So Lofter, I know people have taken that as sky or air.
Mm-hmm.
I have an alternative explanation for that sees it as the past participle of the verb, an archaic past participle of the verb loba, to praise. So he's the praised one, or the praiseworthy one.
Okay.
This is actually something that's done with gods sometimes, where you give a god who's sort of dangerous, kind of on the edges. You give him a flattering name. Actually, Shiva is an example of this. Shiva means like the civil one, but Shiva's a very destructive god.
Right.
So Lofter then would be an example of a flattering name for a destructive deific figure. So I don't think it has to do with sky or air. I think it's like praised one,
Mm-hmm.
kind of an ironic name. You know, in general, I'm very resistant to allegorical interpretations. I'm very resistant, especially like elemental allegorical interpretations. I just don't think the stuff is there in the Eddas. I don't think that there's much to build on with this. Loki, and especially the Loki fire thing, the only time Loki's associated with fire that I can think of is when he fails to start a fire, and the story of him and Odin and Hunir meeting Thjazi as an eagle in Skaldskaparmal in the Proto. So,
Jotunheim.
yeah, as the other thing, Loki having something to do with the word for a mirage, I distantly feel like I've heard that somewhere, but I think it's actually not a related word.
Yeah, because I just went to my notes,
moment.
like, after watching that video, I was like, where did we come up with that? And I have all my old notes, and I was just going through that, and it was just, I think we ended up having those, 17th, 18th, 19th century books in that library, where I think some of those were probably commissioned by, rich families that said, find out everything about our rich history and our mythology and whatnot, and someone went off and did their research as quickly as possible to get paid. And so I probably not the most reliable sources.
A lot of these 19th and early 20th century translators are really enthusiastic and have just these flights of fancy about what's connected to what. They've got all these big everything's a big idea. All the sources are corrupt one way or another, so we got to figure out what they really say and who's really who. I'm much more. I'm much more willing to take the text as it is and say, well, this is what the Eddas say, and if you want to spend 18 layers of speculation on top of that, okay. But I want you to be aware of what it actually says right there in Old Norse.
I suppose it's kind of like even in literature, where you have a lot of Ray Bradbury used to say this, where people used to ask him about books like Fahrenheit 451. So, oh, did you mean to put that allegory here? Did you mean to connect these themes? And he would just say, no.
Yeah, right.
It's
And I
it's just
usually
a
feel like they're,
yeah.
no, that's not to say that people aren't clever for figuring some connection between this, that, or the other. I just don't necessarily think it's there to the originators of it,
Mm.
Mhm.
right? You can spin all kinds of creations out of it that you want. Just be aware that that's your creation and not something you're seeing in those ancient texts. But a lot of that kind of speculation's been around for so long that it's just in the water, right? People are going to read about this stuff on the internet a long time before they're going to check out the primary sources in most cases. So they're often going to bring these kinds of priors with them.
That's why I was
Um,
curious about those kennings in terms of what other sources were there for kennings that you're aware of besides
well, the
the ones
sources
that
are
we've
the
known.
poems that they're used in,
Right.
right? So it's the whole body of skaldic poetry, and there's actually not many kennings in Eddic poetry.
But I mean,
Um,
books that kind of
you know,
describe them
or
more, like a book
well,
on
there's the
kennings. Yeah.
Skaldic project. If
Mhm.
you just Google the Skaldic project, you can very quickly find um, this large uh, team of scholars in the last 30 years who've been working on essentially indexing all the kennings, and you can find their index, right, listed by what the kennings are for and what elements are in the kennings or who came up with the kenning. Um, Kennings are something that really obsess some people. I haven't ever quite caught the kenning mania, but if you're into it, this the Skaldic Poetry Project
That'd be
is
interesting because I'd like to
a huge
track
resource.
down the original sources where we ended up doing finding those associations because yeah, it was long hours in the library, and I remember it wasn't the sources that you had mentioned in the video, so I was like, something else.
Well, check out the Skaldic Poetry Project. It's easy to find. If you just Google that, I'm sure you go
I
straight
just
to the
did.
page.
Yep, I've got
Yeah.
it.
One of my friends, she said that she's automatically checking it out right now.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's been going on for a long, long time.
Have you contributed to it at all?
I've not, like I said, I've never really caught the
No.
kenning mania. But it's a long term project of several um, very invested scholars, and specifically that poetry and literature. I mean, it is their magnum opus, so there's nothing there for me to touch. But it's a project I respect a lot, and it's not even yet complete, but I know they publish a lot more every year.
Aaron, did you have something you wanted to ask?
Actually, I was going to ask you if you wanted to ask about the dialects now, since that
Yeah,
would be a perfect good time.
I always want to talk about language, but I wanted to ask about specific dialects for all the Scandinavian. Uh, well, all right, rephrase. Fever brain not working, but how many dialects do you think of Old Norse were there by the end of the period?
I
Because I
don't know
mean,
how
we
to
have.
quantify that. There's a broad west-east distinction,
Mhm.
right? Although people exaggerate how clean it is, right? So there's a border zone between west and east where you find them. So, for example, even in southwestern Sweden, you can find a fair amount of what are supposedly West Norse features, and same in parts of Jutland and Denmark. And then in eastern Norway, you can find what are supposed to be East Norwegian features. So really, what it is that it's features that they're isoglosses sometimes,
Mhm.
uh, kind of make a Venn diagram, but they broadly center west and east. So you know, there's some really diagnostic stuff there, like the word for eye, right, is ek in West Norse, but yak in East Norse. So that's a
Mm.
very diagnostic one. So there's those two big groups. I Well, in the 1200s, you can already tell Icelandic and Norwegian apart within the Western group.
Mhm.
You can you can tell Swedish and Danish apart within the Eastern group. Um, there are probably already some even hyper local features. It's fascinating how many times in Havamal the poem of Odin's wisdom in the Poetic Edda. It's fascinating how many times you'll come across a word that is not preserved in Icelandic or even in mainstream Norwegian, but you can find in some obscure Norwegian dialect. So sometimes there's vocabulary that's probably already kind of regionally restricted. So I wouldn't know how to quantify it, but I would say there's broad west, broad east, and within the western eastern groupings, there's some strong regional variation already, especially between what become the countries we know today.
What about intonation? Is there any way, I mean, obviously, as we were talking before, there's no way really to mark it down, but in written, is there any way to tell? Because now, obviously now, depending where you live in Norway, the musicality of the accent changes a lot. Is there any way? Yeah. So that people from Bergen, yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is really vexed. Some people think that Old Norse had tone distinctions in the way that Norwegian and Swedish do, and some people think that it didn't. I don't know if it's possible to prove. There are some early modern accounts of Swedes making fun of a Danish accent. And
to be fair, we all make fun. We all make fun of Danish.
Oh, sure, but it actually sounds a lot like the kind of stuff Swedes say about Danes today, which suggests that already Danish doesn't have that musical accent, but has the st that it marks it today, because it seems to be what they're kind of making fun of. So the thing is, in Danish patterns with one of the tones in Norwegian and Swedish.
Interesting.
Right. So either Norwegian Swedish tone and Danish st come from some phenomenon in Old Norse they've all lost, or Old Norse had st, tone developed out of that, or Old Norse had tone and st developed out of that, because they pattern together. But then Icelandic and Faroese don't have any of it.
Yeah, nothing.
So my I guess if you just held a knife to my throat right this second, I don't know that there's great evidence that Old Norse everywhere had tone in the Norwegian or Swedish sense.
Okay.
It's interesting to me that the languages that don't have it, Icelandic and Danish and Faroese, are on the margins. And it's often the margins of language communities that have more archaic features. But there was something there, whether it was tone or stub or something else, that later sets the stage for tone to develop in Norwegian and Swedish, although differently in different dialects. When I was working with Grimfrost, the guys who make all the cool Viking
who sponsor all your
stuff,
videos.
They sponsor my videos, and they also make movies, little movies. I wrote some old Swedish dialogue for one of their little movies, and the actors were all Swedish, and I said, it's probably realistic for old Swedish that you use tone distinctions like you would use in modern Swedish. So go ahead and feel free to just basically use your modern Swedish intonation. But I don't know that would be true of Old Danish or Old Icelandic or what have you, and I don't know how to find out.
And I don't know if there is any way of finding out. I mean, I remember when I did a bunch of archaeological papers about old dialects for England. Even if somebody writes, Arthur was here and he said this, and you find that shard and you can prove it and you can date it, you'll never know if that either was really the Arthur or what they sounded like, or there's no way. There's just no way.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and of course there's always going to be identity questions that come into it, with what people think about it one way or the other. So I just have no idea how I'd ever find out. Maybe someone will devise some ingenious test for it. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I can't think of what it would be.
In before time machines.
Yeah.
And we ruin everything.
Oh yeah, I mean,
well,
you know what though? That would be worth a cataclysmic butterfly effect world-ending event.
Yes
Just to find out the language. The big question of, What did they sound like? Were their tones? I would end the world for that. That's fine.
The first
Don't give
Tarantino
Michelle the
movie.
TARDIS.
Well, who knows? Right now, there may be some grad student who's actually coming up with a great idea for how to test for this. So I wouldn't say it's impossible that there could be some way that, you know, some simpleton like me would never be able to come up with about how to test for it.
We know dialects, right? So again, even today with our Canadian English, or even places like Newfoundland, which have a very specific accent, they all have their own tones of even asking questions.
Yeah.
So even if I were to keep a Canadian accent saying, "Do you have the newspapers?" Very obviously, that's more of a Southeast British intonation. So there's no way to get that from the context of written.
Nope. It's all that super segmental stuff. Very difficult to get a hand on without a recording.
Even now, like we were talking before, even nowadays with IPA, it's severely deficient in getting music, and we really do. I'm going to do it. I'm going to take a piece of some speech, put it in IPA, and put it on a musical scale in the key of C, and we'll see if it works.
Send it to Simon Roper. He'll be interested to see you carrying on his work.
Well, it might be difficult to do. I don't know if I'd be able to do it with your specific accent or dialect, only because you are a very calm D minor. I would need to get somebody like Aaron, who has a little bit of a valley uptick when he talks sometimes, like that. That you could do, but I mean, you would constantly have glisses upwards, and it wouldn't be very musical.
Well, supposedly my super segmentals are hard to figure out, so
I don't
I'll
understand that. You sound perfectly fine like a Northern Texan to me. I don't anyway. I don't know why would they say that. What exactly about them is so distinct or different from any other North Texan, South Missourian? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
I don't know. But it's interesting that you. But it's interesting that you're one of the people that notices the Texas features, because, like I said, a lot of people, like I always get the, like, I get one extreme or the other. Like, I don't hear any kind of accent or the, whoa, that guy sounds really, really Texan. But it depends on, you know, we talked about this a little bit before I think we started recording. It's the way I speak English is basically picked up from my grandparents, but then that's a time machine in a sense, right? Because there's not that many people my age that sound like I do.
Right, it's all disappearing too.
Yeah, so it's like I have a regional accent, but it's a regional accent from 100 years ago, right? So it's weird.
You had said I think recently that you had noticed that I always go on about British and Irish dialects, and it's a shame how at least the Irish ones sort of are being preserved. I mean, their do support is now disappearing in their new and upcoming dialects, accents, things like that they're purporting now, again, mostly probably because of internet availability. And so that's all going away. The 2B though is still there. But in especially in England, Simon's gone on about this, about how like West Country dialects are just disappearing completely, and there's no more distinction between, let's say, a Devon accent and a Wiltshire accent. That's kind of disappearing. But I had noticed, and in that conversation, you had said that people from where I grew up in New York, now people in upstate New York will say things like y'all, yins, that kind of thing, and yet where I grew up with my grandfather and his Brooklynese accent, again, that working class Brooklynese accent's all disappearing. And it's now become, as you said, a more of a rural versus city accent. So somebody who's from the city would speak like Aaron does, where he has the like punctuations and everything. And then somebody who's more rural would take on some of your features, but not exactly keep your accent. That, like the what, the where, the aspirated W's and H's, they're all disappearing. And even though it is sad, it's nice to have some sort of, having your voice is sort of like a time capsule. Because usually when you hear these accents, it's usually on a recording with some dirt tape, and you don't really get to have that nice clear sense of what an accent sounded, what that region sounded like at a specific time period.
Sure. Well, I mean, there used to be a huge difference between, you know, Georgia
Yeah.
and Texas and Virginia and Wisconsin. You know, these used to be really different things. But yeah, my larger point with Simon is that I think that what you've got is you have a kind of cosmopolitan city culture that gravitates toward one norm, and then a pretty much country music culture that gravitates toward another, and that both are sort of hyper local, um, but but non localized
Versus cosmopolitanized.
Yeah, but they're caricatures too in a way, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like because you know, I have a fair amount of what used to be considered Southern U.S. English features, but they're not necessarily part of the caricature of Southern U.S. English today.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like this caricature that's kind of grown out of, I think, basically country music, which often involves really fake accents that people have just adopted all over as kind of a badge of rural identity.
Or new country, as they say, because I guess old country music would be now what we call bluegrass or old time. So.
Yeah, or outlaw country in terms of like older style stuff being played today. Yeah. Anyway, that's a whole sociolinguistic phenomenon that I remain curious about, and a little bit outside of, just because of my own weird background with it.
Look at poor Andrew. I've put him to sleep already. I'm sorry.
No, he's just struggling with his migraine. That's or at least the aftermath.
I had
of
a
it.
very rough day today.
I'm so sorry.
He's formatting the
Well,
drive
it's-
I was replying
well,
IT. So
Well, it's a lot later there, but I'm also an old man, so I mean, for me, it already nears bedtime.
Okay, goodbye.
You're mountain time, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
oh,
But I'm
okay.
old. I drift off real early and get up real early. I have
Well,
it's so many ways.
You're Dr. the King Cowboy, so you have to get up early for the cows.
Well, I mean, it's sort of the attitude I grew up with. Yeah. I adopted so many things from my grandparents that way.
Well, bring a sword out
But
with
yeah,
you
the
when you
accent
go
and
see the
dialect stuff.
cows. Just make sure, in case there's more black bears waiting for you.
Well, could be. There was one across the street a few weeks ago. So they're always around.
It's because now you're getting to be too famous. They know where you live, and they want to come say hi.
Well, I mean, the bears are sort of welcome. They don't bother me.
So
Grizzly bears are different.
I actually I watched one of your videos recently, the one on magical weapons, just because it's a special place in my heart, and I have like a very special, well, magical and cursed actually was more accurate. It's one of your more recent ones. So I'm just curious, like, what exactly would like the RPG or any equivalent be of like achieving victory as a magical effect? Do you think? Like, what would that be as a descriptor? Like, if I was to put this into an RPG mechanic, and just to follow that up, what's everyone's favorite like fight game magical weapon or whatnot, or item?
Well, if this were rifts, I would just say that the sword does MDC, and
Oh my
like,
god, that's a name I haven't heard in so long. Oh my god.
and it does like 100 times more mega damage than the
Yes.
sword in the most recent stuff. That would be a pretty easy.
That's the thing with these mythological weapons, is they're always over the top descriptions. They do not miss. They slice through all armor. They kill whoever they hit. It's platitude
But then
after
you would
Not, they need to
platitude.
kill before being put away.
Yeah.
that's an
You would have to hope though for that one that everybody else that it's killing is SDC.
Right. Well, but I mean, it's rifts, so it won't make sense anyway. I just because I love.
Oh, I know. I also have a love hate with that whole all the Palladian systems, all the Palladian systems.
The Heartbreaker
Well,
systems.
that was almost all that I played. That was what was big in Colorado when I was young.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I don't know exactly what you would call its real gameplay equivalent. You probably have to sort of de-exaggerate it, because in a sense, it always kind of feels like these descriptions are being written by munchkins, right? You know, it's well, but it's true not just of weapons; it's kind of everything, right? You know, every woman is the most beautiful woman of all. Every man is the wisest king or the greatest fighter, or he can jump the highest or whatever. Like it's always superlatives, right? But the thing about superlatives is there's always, you know, you can always
Super
find
superlatives.
step up.
Yep.
Yeah. Which is actually, there's a stanza in Hogwarts about that. So, you know, I don't know. I guess you would just have to say it deals more damage than the opponent's weapon by d6 or something. I guess is one way you could do it, is just make it kind of dependent on what you're fighting and say that it's better than that. That would be one way to handle it, as it being always victorious.
All right, sounds
Your
good.
opponent has a +3 sword, so this becomes a +4 sword.
Exactly.
Whatever your opponent's plus is, yours is +1.
Yeah,
Because
like that's
it's
one way you
victory.
could do it.
That's actually pretty good. Damn it.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna write that down and have my players fight against that. So anyway,
Oh yeah. I'm gonna tell Matt Colville that I had an actual original RPG thought. He'll
whoa.
be so proud of me. He'll be so proud. You know, it's actually thanks to him that my channel got rolling
Oh yeah.
Really?
a couple of years ago. It was him promoting my videos that really started the traffic coming in. So I have a lot I owe him.
Nice.
You either love him or hate him at this moment, depending on how many videos you have planned for the week.
Well, I know he's prolific. I always do 2 videos a week though. I'm pretty consistent about that.
We're trying to get to that.
As far as favorite magical swords and weapons, I don't know. I just finished translating, or not just finished translating, but I just finished getting this book published, so I'm still pretty attached to Tyrvinger. It is a cool sword, and you know, it's even used to play a prank based on its magic abilities. So you have to read the saga to see what I'm talking about with that.
Yep.
Oh no, I'm very curious now. Considering the features, I guess
Frank.
I'm gonna call them of the sword.
A prank is played based on the common knowledge of its powers. Yes.
And I
Or
love
Sagas
the
do
way
pranks.
the sword finds its way to the most delinquent child. It's the cursed sword
yeah,
that's going to cause the
deliberately.
most problems, and Mom's gives it to the most irresponsible child.
Well, she loves him more.
Of course.
This sounds like bad ideas.
Yeah, I went through half of that translation. I put it at the back of Illuminated Edda because I needed actually Tyrfing as part of Ragnarok. So I didn't finish it. This is something that a lot of people have asked. Like, where's the second half? I said, well, we'll have to get the addendum in there as well on the second printing, maybe. But it's a great one. I absolutely love that story. What was the name of that sword that reanimated the 2 armies at night? The 2 armies that were fighting, and then the heroine.
You're talking about in Sword of Lothar, where you have King Heaven and King Hogni that are fighting forever.
Yes. Yeah. The name's not coming to me right
if
now.
the
My
sword
brain is fried.
If the sword is named to that, I don't remember the name, but it might be.
I think it is.
So,
That'd be my pick. That one is just a crazy one. How about you, Michelle?
Oh, I'm going away from all of you, and I'm gonna pick the. I'm not picking something Norse. Because that's not my specialty. I leave that to the 2 of you, but I'm gonna pick the cauldron from the Mabinogion, which is called where everything that is life and death comes out of it.
Nice.
And considering my specialty is life and death, and the suffering that falls in between, that's good. I feel not necessarily that would make me powerful. I don't think so. I just think it fits my aesthetic, and therefore.
It's a solid magic item.
Mm-hmm.
I
It
might
is.
I might be biased, but I kind of have a really like strong love for something I created, which is not really a Viking, but it counts because it's in a Viking RPG.
Is it your hair?
And it's my sentient shovel, actually.
Yes.
And I,
Yes.
I love it so much. It's such a sassy little shovel. It like in a nutshell, we were kind of like, where were we going exactly? Andrew?
Greenland. You guys had to
Greenland.
create a outpost in Greenland. You guys were
Yeah.
leaving Icelandia.
And they made the horrible decision of letting me basically write down all the equipment because that's yeah. So I brought one shovel, and due to this, my character ended up trying to create more shovels. And what he ended up doing is creating sentient shovels, and that
One
sentient
big
shovel tried to-
sentient shovel.
and it tried to take over the world, but it will succeed, I think, one day. But that's pretty. It glows as well, but it's
And
literally just called
I
shovel.
could see a sentient shovel having its uses. You know, I've had to make some driveways. I probably would have used a sentient shovel.
Digging up all the
appears
cow
where,
fat.
it appears where it is needed, and also appears when kingdoms fall.
Yeah, bury them.
So
It's 10. Would you like to give your parting words so we can let Dr. Crawford go to sleep?
Even though it's earlier for me, but I'm an old man, so.
So there was one question I wanted to ask while we've got you here, in terms of our fan base that wants to potentially read other sources beyond the Eddas. One of the things that I point them to is obviously the Heimskringla and the Gesta Norum. Those were two sources that basically just open it up wide in terms of so many more stories and a lot more context on the stories that were already found in the Sagas and the Eddas. But if you were to top 3 other sources that people can go to just widen their knowledge, that maybe are underrated and fly under the radar for people.
To top 3 sources,
So
he has
far-
3 books. There you go.
Yeah, right. So, but primary sources other than the Eddas.
Yeah, not the Eddas, not the Heimskringla, not the Gesta Norum.
Okay, Saga of the Volsungs, translated by me. Uh,
Of course, we'll have the link down
And
at the
then-
bottom. You can buy it.
I'll forgo mentioning the other saga book translated by me, and I'll be fairer. So there's a book called 7 Viking Romances, which is a terrible title. I don't know why they used it, because it's romance in the older sense of like adventure. It's not
Right.
It's not romance novels, but it's 7 really interesting sagas. It includes Odd and Gautrek, and I'm pretty sure it includes Egil One Hand. Just some wild adventure sagas that really get into some of the definitely the weirder edges of the mythical heroic sagas, the Fornaldir Saga. That's translated by Herman Paulson and Paul Edwards. So that would be another good book of primary sources. And then said not Heimskringla and not Gesta Norum. So I've already mentioned some sagas like that.
And Jacobson.
I also, well, Armand Jacobson, yeah, but he's a secondary source. Primary sources, just I might clump together some of these Gothic and Lombardic historians like Jordanes and Paul the Deacon. There's some surprisingly mythic stuff there, and also gives a nice window into the early history of Germanic-speaking peoples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
How about that?
Yeah, those are good ones. Absolutely. One that I would just toss in there as a little gateway book is Pedraic Column's The Children of Odin. So it's people that have never ever been exposed to Norse mythology. I find that's a nice, really, really easy read that can get people into the myths, and it's cute.
I've
It's
never seen
illustrated
it.
nicely. Oh, you've never seen it? No, he's a author from the late 1800s, and he did the Berserker King, so some Celtic myths as well. And he was kind of like a beloved C.S. Lewis type of writer, like from 150 years ago or so. So, yeah, I've gifted that book, The Children of Odin, to a couple of people that had no knowledge of Norse mythology and were curious.
How is his language? Is it nice and Victorian?
It's kind of it's slightly Victorian, but it's more written, I guess, maybe for
Like-
children. So it's just super accessible. Like,
Okay, so if it's Victorian and written for children, it'll be better than most books written nowadays. That's fine.
yeah,
And Andrew knows I'm very much a stickler for language, and if it is not, I will say good, then I get irritable.
Oh, okay. Well,
Well, it's just that I, being such a lover of language and being an author, it's what the books I studied most, and my specialty is Regency and Victorian. So when, and also with a little bit of Edwardian in there, but when I read something that's written nowadays, say I have Yeats here and all that, but when I read something that's more modern, if the language is not concrete, if it's not, if there's no prose, I need the prose. Give me something good. Give me something crunchy, where I find the too much of the modern stuff is just written in third person limited, and they just write it off, and that's it. So I
kind of see what you mean. I don't know what you'd necessarily think of my quote unquote prose.
I have your books in the
But
other
I know
room.
what you mean.
They're fine.
Well, but I mean, like,
So,
original
but as you
prose.
say, you're a time traveler from 100 years ago, so you fit in perfectly.
Well, maybe.
All right.
no, it
And-
definitely works.
I appreciate.
So we've
I appreciate the time,
we've gone 2 hours.
and I hope
Thank you
I
very
hope that
much.
your audience has not totally fallen asleep.
No, actually, I've been watching. There have been more and more people coming on as we're going on. I was afraid, especially with all the linguistic stuff, I was afraid that people who are more tuned into what you do as a specialty in terms of the Norse stuff, and not necessarily about your linguistics work, would fall asleep, because that's the easiest way to get anybody away from me is, let's talk about linguistics for an hour. Okay.
No.
Or let's talk about languages.
Yeah.
So
No.
No, I have that power as well. I understand.
do we have any questions from our Twitch audience? So before we wrap, like maybe there are some questions from our viewers, and then we
Brittany, do you have a question? Quick, get it in now.
because we've got 2 hours here. We've set a record, I think, for a fireside chat.
Yes,
Jackson,
we have.
achievement
I
unlocked.
love editing.
Where's the fire? Where's the fire?
I edit that in.
Where's my lighter?
No, nope.
No
Nothing,
questions?
nothing that I
Okay,
see.
there we go.
No,
There
doesn't
we
look
go.
like it. So.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you
Oh, wait,
very
wait,
much.
I'll warm my hands.
Brittany says, I have no question except to say thank you. Dr. Jackson's work has always been a boon to the Recon Heathen community. There you go.
Awesome. All
Well,
right.
that's very kind of you. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for
Skål.
joining us this week to this episode. I
Here,
was
my-
gonna do the exit part, but
My fever dream Pedialyte. It's exactly what it is, unfortunately.
Aaron, you want to do your
I'll-
exit for the
I'm
video?
going to.
Go,
Yeah,
go.
I don't have to edit this out. Well, thank you for joining us this week of the Fireside Chat. If you have joined us, if you haven't already, please be sure to follow us on Twitch or on YouTube and Facebook. We're pretty much on all those platforms. Or any one of us on Twitter. I don't know about you guys. And pretty much next week, we're going to be having a bit of an interesting guest. We've reached out to Wardruna and Amana Marath. I'm trying not to mispronounce this.
What?
Uh,
Are
Yeah.
you
so-
serious?
Yeah, I'm talking to
No
the
promises?
publicist right now, so we'll see. We'll see what happens.
But yeah, so if you're interested in any of that, definitely feel free to tune in next week. So thank you for joining us, and Skull.
Skål!
It's-